I am here with Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry. They have written around 6 books together. Welcome.
Hi,
Thank you
AJ.
so much, AJ, for this opportunity.
So this is the 6th book, Proof of Life After Life. 7 reasons to believe there is an afterlife, right?
That's
Let's
correct.
begin with Raymond and see what he has to say about this book. Last time we talked, you mentioned that this was perhaps your most important book.
Yeah, I think so, AJ, because, for 50 years, people have been asking me, usually because they're mourning the loss of a loved one or facing death themselves, or just in that midlife curiosity, wanting to know about the afterlife. For decades, people have been asking me, um, is there proof? It's almost desperation. People want so much to know. Well, I was a professor of logic, and I understand the difficulties and just on a logical proof of an afterlife. However, I've also realized over the years that's not what people are asking. They want something not so formal about symbolic logic, but they're more asking this question, and that is it rational to be confident that there's an afterlife? That's what people want to know. And I say, absolutely yes. And I think that for 2 reasons. One is just very hard to think yourself out of all these near-death experiences. I mean, really, it's to say, oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain. I'm sorry, that's fear. People like to have something that they're afraid of focused in a narrow corridor. And so it comforts people to say, oh, some people say, oh, this is life after death. Others say this is oxygen deprivation to the brain. That at least tames it. But the real fact is that bystanders at the death of someone else who are not themselves ill or injured have all of these same things that we think of as a near-death experience. Often as the person in the bed dies, the bystander says, as grandma died, I got out of my body and went partway toward this light with her, or the room filled with light, or I saw apparitions of my mother's deceased relatives come into the room, or I heard music. Or most remarkably, AJ, I've had a number of people over the years who've told me that they empathically co-lived the life review of somebody who was dying. And I mean, I give up. I just can't think my way out of that. And so that's why I'm confident, is that although all my life I've tried to think of the reasons why not, you see, is more satisfying, because my way of thinking is you want to think of all the objections first. And I've done it that way, and I can't think my way out of it. So I have to say to those people that ask that, yeah, I think it is entirely rational to sort of expect that, yeah, when we die, to my utter astonishment, that there is something else.
Yes, I agree. I think, according to what I talked with Paul and with you, this is a book basically focused on shared death experiences. And I would like to know Paul's opinion, because this is your 6th book co-written with Dr. Raymond Moody, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So you also mentioned that this is one of your most important books. Basically, you said that this really brings out the proof of near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Can you mention something?
Well, let me take it to the beginning here. What a shared death experience is. It's when a person who is well shares the death experience of a person who is dying. So, for example, there's cases reported in which medical doctors, nurses, and other hospital personnel see the spirit of a patient leave their body at the point of death. these doctors aren't related to the patient, so you can't really say they're empathic experiences. And the same would go for something we call precognitive experiences, in which the spirit of a dying patient appears to someone who is not close to them at all necessarily, but usually shared death experiences happen between loved ones. That is true. So the primary difference between a shared death experience, though, and a near-death experience is that the shared death experience is an objective experience. So, in other words, a near-death experience can only be experienced by one person, and they're the only ones who can really truly describe it. Evidence in court wouldn't work that way. You can't just have one person providing evidence. You have to have confirmation of those events, and that's what a shared death experience does. Is that a person who experiences someone else's death experience is providing objective proof that something happened when that person died, something, for want of a better word, something mystical. Now,
Okay.
Well, let me say,
excuse me.
let me also say that Raymond and I worked together for 30 years now. And over those years, we've always, in all of our books, we've had examples of shared death experiences.
Yeah,
we've collected them for 30 years.
Wow.
And I really don't think it was until we each had our own shared death experiences that we decided that this is something that needs to be looked at in itself as being proof of life after death.
Okay, we're going to go over the 7 reasons, and then we're going to talk a little bit about your own shared death experiences. I am aware that Raymond had one with his mother, but I didn't know, Paul, that you also had one. So, but first, let's go quickly over the 7 reasons. Reason number 1, out-of-body experiences, OBEs. What can you say?
Well, out-of-body experiences, as you know, AJ, are a common part of near-death experiences. People say that as their heart stops beating, that they leave their body and they look at the scene from above. They're out of their body. And not only that, but even though they can see and understand what's going on, between the doctors and nurses, for example, not that they hear a voice, but they understand it as a mind-to-mind or heart-to-heart communication. Nobody is able to see them or to hear them, and yet people say in this thing, say while they were out of their body, they heard their doctors say, "Oh my God, he's dead," or words to that effect. But I've heard repeatedly people from all over the world, AJ, saying about this. I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead, because people go into hyper consciousness. Now, the near-death experience is not the only setting in which an out-of-body experience occurs. They can occur most remarkably to me in performance of great music. I have a friend, Eric Pagani, who's a concert pianist and a psychologist in Paris. And Eric was telling me years ago about how he was playing a concert and suddenly he left his body. He was in this light for 17 minutes. And when he came back to the piano, he had played three pieces. So Eric is just this very modest guy. And I said, well, Eric, did the audience seem to appreciate the music? And he said, oh, yes, they seem to. Fortunately, his sister was there. And she had been at the concert, and she said people jumping up and down, screaming and yelling. And so he said, well, as a psychologist, he said, if this has happened to me, it's happened to other musicians. So he interviewed a lot of his friends who were operatic singers. And he did this great book, sadly not published other than in France, but it's all about his operatic star friends who had out-of-body experiences while performing great music.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, let's go with reason number 2. Let's go, Paul. What can you tell us about the precognitive events? Reason number 2.
Precognitive experiences. It's when a person unexpectedly sees the death of another person, or has foreknowledge of the paranormal kind, that person will die, or that there's actually a precognitive psychic experience, would be an example. So we have examples, and we have a couple of interesting examples in the book. One is of a doctor who woke up and he saw his father standing at the foot of his bed. And his father said to him, without moving his lips, it was a psychic communication. He said, call your mother right away. She has something to tell you. And it turned out that his mother couldn't reach him because his telephone had been off, but that the father had just died. And that's one such example of a precognitive experience. Another one was kind of a fascinating one with a woman named Olga Gerhardt in San Diego. She was someone who had a heart transplant, and she was at the hospital getting her heart transplant. She had a large family. The whole family was there at the hospital, with the exception of her son-in-law, who couldn't stand to be in hospital, so he went home. And he went home and he went to bed. So there were a lot of problems with her heart. They transplanted it. It kept stopping, starting, acting erratically, and they were afraid they were going to lose her. And in the midst of this, because he knew what time it was, he wrote down the time, she appeared at his bed. And once again, she appeared at the foot of his bed, and he said, I thought you were getting a heart transplant. And she says, well, I am, and I want you to know that everything is okay. I've had some problems, but everything is fine. Tell everybody that I'm all right. So he got dressed, went to the hospital, and told everyone that about his precognitive dream, and told them that she was going to be all right, which she was. Later in the morning, they all went into her hospital room, and the first thing she said when they all got in there was, I left this hospital last night and I went to see you, and I told you that I was going to be okay. So in a way, that's like a double precognitive experience, a double shared death experience. And so that's what a precog experience is.
Wow, that's really amazing. Okay, so let's go with reason number 3, Dr. Moody, the transforming light.
Yeah, as you know, AJ, from the folks you've talked with, a lot of people, as part of this, say, often they get out of their body, they go through a passageway, and they come into a light that defies description. No matter how articulate or how many languages they speak, or no matter how brilliant, people say there are no words for this. But they say the light is a light of comfort and love that is so astonishing. People say that there's nothing comparable to it in this realm. And in that light, say that relatives or friends of theirs who've already died are there as role of a greeting committee, almost, to help them over. Then it goes on. While in the light, then people say that everything disappears, and they're surrounded by a hologram almost, or a panorama of everything they've ever done. Time stands still. They see everything they've ever done, and they review it not just from their perspective, but from the feelings of those with whom they've interacted. And in that life review, they often experience in the presence of a being of sheer light. And again, people say compassion that you can't even describe. Some people say Christ, some people say God, some people say whatever they say, it's all the same description. And people come back from this transformed. AJ, before I was 31 years old, I had 2 doctoral degrees, Plus, I taught philosophy for 3 years. Had a PhD in philosophy. Then I was a philosophy professor for three years. Then I went to medical school, and I had my MD before I was 31. Well, you're old enough to know, and I'm old enough to know that there was something terribly wrong with somebody who would have 2 doctoral degrees by the age of 31, right? Clear? Yeah, it's obvious at this
You're a
age.
bright kid.
Well, I spent my life with my nose in a book. And so maybe that was why that occurred to me when I was a psychiatrist. One of the first things I observed was that every patient I had was chasing something, right? Some people chase money, some people chase fame or power or knowledge, as in my case. But whatever people searching for or chasing, when they have this experience, they say, what this thing we're in is all about is learning to love. Everything else kind of disappears in significance compared to that. Now, I don't know if you've ever interviewed Dr. Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon from
Yes, I have.
Harvard.
Yes, I have.
Eben was telling me, I said, and Eben, in this world, we are oriented by the 2 axes of time and space. But over there, there's no such thing as time and space. And I said, what are the orienting axes over there? And he said, love and knowledge.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
That's interesting. Yeah, people talk about unconditional love. A lot of near-death experiencers mention that. Okay, let's go for reason number 4 to believe there is an afterlife. Let's go with Paul. Terminal lucidity.
Terminal lucidity. It's defined as a flash of life that takes place shortly before one's death. It can be quite dramatic because it takes place in people who are essentially dead. Some from something like Alzheimer's, others from cancers or from trauma. I've seen one before. When my son was in the hospital, this was in the 1990s for a broken femur, and I would go in and see him constantly. And across the hall, they brought a man in who was essentially dead from dementia, and they put him into the bed across the hall. And I went over and tried to speak to him, but he really wasn't there. And then the next day, his family came. He had 7 family members. He stood up on the bed and he began talking to each one of them, talking to them about how wonderful it was to have been their father or their grandfather, and what the future would hold for them, and how he was sorry to be leaving, but he felt so good now. And they were elated because they thought he had come back. He'd come back essentially from the dead. He'd gotten over his dementia, and they thought they could take him home later that afternoon. Well, I came into the hospital the next day and the bed was empty and he had passed away. And that's a standard trait of terminal lucidity, is that people at essentially, like I said, at the point of death will suddenly have this vivid energy and they talk like they were 20 years younger. And they talk clearly about family business or about their love for one another. And I have a feeling that once, this is not a really very well known, is it called a syndrome, Raymond, or
Syndrome?
Yeah, it's not a well-known syndrome, but once it becomes more well-known through this book, and through, it's actually showing up in medical papers now, when people, when their medical record is taken, did this person have a moment of terminal lucidity? But once people start to find out about it, I think it's going to be the most common experience that other people experience when they go into a situation where a family member is dying.
Yeah, I've heard that many people who work in hospices, they witness this effect. It's pretty common, and it usually takes place a few hours before the person dies.
That's
so
right.
Let's go with reason number 5. spontaneous muses, healings, and skills. Let's go, Dr. Raymond.
Yeah, AJ, I have sort of eventually, as you know, just kind of given up on trying to think my way out of this. And I've tried, what I like to do is try to think of the reasons why not. That's the logical way to do it, is you try to knock things down rather than to establish what you already think. But one reason I gave up is I have this friend, and his name is Anthony Chicoria, and he is a PhD in physiology and an MD and a renowned professor of orthopedic surgery at New York University. And in 1994, at a family reunion at a resort center, Anthony was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning and had a cardiac arrest. And he got out of his body. Went all over this resort center. He's able to see his relatives. He, didn't know he was dead. And then he, when he was telling us, he said, questions arise, is this like a dream? He said, no, this is more real than real. That's what people say, that this is hyper reality. It's nothing like a dream state or a foggy experience. And so when he got back from that, although he had never been interested in music, he suddenly developed unaccountably an interest in the piano and started having a recurrent dream in which he was playing a certain piece of music on a concert stage on the piano. So he learned how to transcribe music so he could transcribe that piece. And he learned the piano. And in addition to being a famed orthopedic surgeon, he's a concert pianist. Okay, now,
Wow.
yeah. And you see, that doesn't fit in, AJ. That doesn't fit in with the consensual reality that you and I were raised in. That's something out of.
I've also interviewed people who have developed healing skills,
Right.
and reading other people's minds, etc. So let's go with recent.
Well, just a minute.
You want to add something? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we also have a great case study with Raymond Moody, who is an anesthesiologist in Bakersfield, and a very important type of anesthesia because he deals with people who are having heart surgery. So it's much more delicate than the usual. He had an infection after he had surgery, prostate surgery, and he got an infection, and he nearly died from the infection. And in the course of his dying, he witnessed the doctors working on him, talking about his experience, what was his infection, making jokes about him, and then he saw his father, who had treated him very abusively as a child, and he went to the edge of hell. And then he went into a tunnel, saw dead relatives that he had never met before, and once some that he had. But then he came into the presence of a bright light. And this light, he couldn't see anything in it, but he had the idea that it was God or an angel. And he was counseled by this light. And when he came out of it, the bright light sort of gave him two angels to be with him, Michael and Raphael. And the unique thing about that is that Raj is Hindu, and he was given two Christian angels. And as his wife said, in our religion we have 50,000 gods. Why did you get stuck with a couple of Christian angels? But they have counseled him now for years, and one of the things they counseled him on was, they told him, you should quit your job as an anesthesiologist and practice consciousness-based healing. Well, he quit his job as an anesthesiologist, to practice consciousness-based healing, but he was never told what consciousness-based healing was. And he would meditate, and he could bring these angels into his meditation, and they wouldn't tell him. They said, you have to continue to search, and that way you'll be able to develop a new type of medicine that's more fit for what you do. So now he's worked on that for years. And he's now starting to practice in consciousness-based healing that deals with addiction and how to get over addiction through meditation and through non-medicinal ways to get over addiction. And that's what he's currently doing. And
Wow.
And back to the music for a minute,
Yeah.
AJ. Incredibly, there are a lot of cases of people who sing themselves out. And this is one of the foundational documents of Western thought, is Plato's Phaedo, which is about the death scene of Socrates. And in the morning, before he's executed, his friends go into the prison, and they find that he's writing songs, which is, all before he's always said, oh, music is trivia. But now, and so his friends are thinking maybe he's slipping, right? That the stress is, but he says, oh, no. He says, I've received dreams and visions that tell me to write music. And he said, he goes on to analogize it to the Greek folk belief that just before swans die, they sing the most beautiful songs of all. And Socrates says that's because they know that they're soon to be in touch with the gods. Now, I read that when I was 18, and I remember to this day, it's just a very vivid memory of reading that image. Now, flash forward 12 years, 1974. I was in my second year of medical skills in my surgery rotation. And so I was walking in a group, and my attendings were kind of walking along right with me, right by. But I walked into the room first, and the patient in there was a woman in her 70s, and we saw her have a cardiac arrest as we were walking into the room. And so you start the resuscitation and so on. But as this was going on, she was reciting poetry. Now, I got interested in this, and subsequently I have found literally hundreds of people over the many years now who say, yeah, just before grandma died, she had never had any interest in poetry, but she started writing poetry or singing. Two people in my association network, and being rather social phobic, I don't have a huge social network, but two people, and that, to my acquaintanceship, sang their way out, just spontaneously, just sang as they were dying. And so, why is it that many people on the verge of death will get into poetry or song? It's very interesting.
It actually even goes beyond that. We have one great case study, Catherine Emmer, and she was a woman who in the 1936-38 suddenly woke up after a lifetime of being unconscious, being out of communication. She had had childhood meningitis. She had never spoken in her entire life. She couldn't make sense of other people talking. She would communicate in grunts or not communicate at all. But on this particular day, as she was passing, she awoke and began to sing. I think the song had a line in it, oh, where does the soul go when we die? And it was everybody, she was in a mental institution, and it's like many of the patients and all the doctors flocked to her room to watch this because it was an amazing phenomenon. And she sang this song for a long period of time. It's the only time they'd ever heard her speak. And then she lay down, needed a rest, and passed away. So there's cases like that. There's a lot of cases like that. But there's also in this chapter and we refer to light and mist. And we have doctors. That's one of the great things about this book is we quote a lot of doctors. A lot of doctors have had these experiences, and now they're more willing to talk about them than they were back in the day when we first wrote The Light Beyond, our first book. And there was one that was told to us by a doctor who said that he was in the doctor's lounge. It was at night. He was reading one of his medical books, and a nurse came in and said, one of your patients is struggling to breathe. You need to go in and check it out. So he did. He went in, he made adjustments in her oxygen. And he said, but still she was going downhill. And then she passed. And as she did, he saw a mist rise from her body and gather above her. And then it was sucked into, it looked like it was sucked into a vacuum tube and disappeared. And we've heard that. That's one of the cases that I worked on. But I know Raymond has had this from other doctors as well, where they talk about the mist. And
seeing the mist leave,
okay, that's part of reason number 6: the light, the mist, and music. So let's begin with reason number 6 to believe there is an afterlife. Yeah.
Well, you can deal with actually there's a really interesting book from the 19th century called Phantasms of, what is the rest? Phantasms of the Living. That's it. Huge book. It's case studies, nothing but case studies. And there were 4 doctors who researched all these case studies. They did a tremendous amount of work on it. It's a wonderful book. But there's a lot of cases in there where they talk about music being heard at the deathbed, for instance. And what happens is sometimes there'll be several people around the deathbed, sometimes just a few, and they start to hear music coming from a source that they can't find. They walk around the house looking for music. They look outside to see if anyone's playing. These were in the days pre-radio. They were before radio. And yet sometimes there'll be as many as 7 or 8 people around the bed. Maybe 5 or 6 will hear the music, and 2 or 3 won't hear the music. And they're very frustrated because they hear everyone else talking about this beautiful music. Sometimes the music persists. Sometimes it can persist for days. And oftentimes it leads to people wanting to recreate the music. The music is so beautiful that they'll work for months, years even, trying to recreate it on the piano or some other musical instrument, and they can't do it. They just can't do it. So that's in part what the light, mist, and music is about.
Great. Well, I think of all the reasons, the most impressive is reason number 7, the Thycomantium. I talked about this the last time I interviewed Raymond, and I talked about it with Paul, and I would like Dr. Raymond Moody to explain to us how you participated in this archaeology expedition and how you found, how did you find the remains that led up to this discovery?
Yeah, AJ, essentially everything that I have studied comes from ancient Greek philosophy. That was and a thing that is, I think it's sensational knowledge that if it came to light, it would have very different experience of the West. But we all know that Western thought came from the ancient Greek philosophers. Well, if you go back to the time of the ancient Greek philosophers, even in the time of Plato, and you ask the average Greek person, what is a philosopher? They would say a philosopher is a person who probes into things up in the air, which means out of body travel. There was a famous man, Hermotimus, around that time who had the ability to leave his body at will and go to great distances. And the philosopher was a person who probed into things in the air, but down under the earth which was a euphemism for calling up the spirits of the dead. The ancient Greeks had institutions called oracles of the dead, where you could go and you could go through various procedures, and you would see and interact with the apparition of your departed loved one. And I had known about this from the ancient Greek history, but I had always assumed that it can't be. It's even Herodotus, the historian, acts as though this is, but I thought, how can that be? It must be a legend. However, in the mid 80s, an archaeologist discovered the main one, the famous Oracle of the Dead that's in the Odyssey and in Herodotus. And based on what he found there in his archaeological report, they found in the central apparition hallway, this was all underground, then they had this long hallway with carbon marks on the walls, which indicates that they had torches. It was lit by torches. And at the end of it, there was this enormous bronze cauldron surrounded by a banister. And so the archaeologists figured this had to be some kind of fraud. But I had a different explanation, because I know that even in the Middle East today, they do this. You take a silver bowl, you highly polish it on the inside, and then fill it with olive oil. And by candlelight in the darkness, if you gaze into that surface, many people would have visions. Like the Aztecs, for example, they did this with what is it? The flinty rock, obsidian mirrors, and it's all over the world. And so when I read that, I had to try it out. So I asked. I was at that time I was teaching graduate students of psychology, so my graduate students of psychology were interested in this, and word spread, and my medical colleagues and a psychiatry colleague and a sociology professor, they got interested in it, and we were just doing it for curiosity. Okay,
this was found in the Oracle of Delphi, right?
No, it's the Oracle of the Dead. The Oracle at Delphi was a different one. This is
because Herodotus mentions the Oracle of Delphi.
He does, and he also mentions the Oracle of the Dead.
Oh, okay, okay, great.
Yeah, and so what I did was I just created a little room, okay, and it's about the size of a walk-in closet so that people won't get claustrophobia. And it initially covered the walls with black material. You can do it just flat black paint, so to create a very dark environment. You put a mirror on the wall at the end of the room, and you place it at such an angle where if you sit in a chair, an easy chair, about 3 feet in front of the wall, and you have the mirror on the wall such that when you look upward into the mirror from your chair, you do not see your own reflection. That's very important, okay? And then behind the chair, I would have a little light bulb about this big around, set up with a dimmer switch, so that the person in the chair could operate the light to bring the light to the level they like. And the main procedure here is just to ask each subject choose one person you knew who has died that you want to see again. And then they would come to my place one at a time. This would be an all-day procedure. And I would just do like I would be in grief counseling. Tell me about this person you lost. What are your best memories of this? What was the unfinished business? What problems were there in the relationship? This lasts about an hour or two. Then you put the person in this room and you tell them just to relax and to gaze into the mirror. And over 50% in the studies that have been done subsequently, AJ, of people who are subjected to this procedure have an experience which they take to be a real event of a reunion with a departed loved one. Some say that they see the image of the departed in the mirror. Other people say that the image appears in the mirror, but then steps out of the mirror into the room with them, three-dimensionally. Others say that their consciousness goes through the mirror into some other realm, and it's there that they meet their departed loved ones. About 30% of them hear an audible voice. They say it's an auditory impression. Almost all of the rest of them, 70% or so, say that although there's no audible voice, there's a heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind communion. And what most surprised me about this work, AJ, was that these were my students. These were people who were informed about the mind. I just assumed that if anybody had something, they would say, yeah, I saw an image in the mirror. It looked like my grandma, but was it real or was it figment? I don't know. That was the reaction that I was expecting.
What
The
about you,
reaction,
Paul?
Yeah.
What was your experience with the psychomantium? Did you actually see it or did you try it out?
Oh, I did try it out, but before that, I really thought that Raymond had gone crazy.
Oh, yeah?
Oh yeah, it seems so impossible. But then there were people who then started to try it, people who were well known. He did a procedure with Joan Rivers, the comedian, and she came out of the psychomantium weeping uncontrollably because she had seen her late husband, Edgar, who had committed suicide. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a shot too. So I went in, and what I saw was I saw my father. We were standing on a pier by a lake, and the colors were magnificent. The colors were much more vivid than ordinary colors. It was almost like my father was in a suit of like neon paint in a way. Yeah, it was very, very bright. The colors were very bright. And he spoke to me, but he didn't move his lips. It was all mental telepathy, if you will. And it didn't last long. He just said, look at this beautiful place. It's just wonderful. And that was it. But it was very vivid. It stayed with me very much over the years.
So what is
And
the
then,
explanation? Is this a true contact with the other side?
well, let me throw this in before he answers that, okay?
Okay.
Later on, a woman came from Argentina, her and her sister, and she wanted to see her late daughter, who died, I think, about 90 days earlier. So she came. It was in the middle of the afternoon. She wanted to be inducted into the right state, and it was too early. She should have relaxed a little bit, but she didn't. So Raymond went ahead and did an induction with her, and nothing happened. She spent over an hour in the psychomantium, and nothing happened. So she and her sister returned to their hotel room. Now this is 3:30 in the afternoon. It's very bright. And they're sitting in their hotel room talking about what had just taken place, apparently talking about trying it again the next day, and how she wishes it had succeeded. And all of a sudden, these orbs come into the room. I have photos of them, and I'll send them to you when we're finished. You can work it into the Zoom call. But they were orbs about this big, 3 of them. We have 2 photos showing 2 of them, but they moved around the room, and one stopped in front of the woman, and she said her daughter was in the orb communicating with her. And she went into kind of a trance meditation conversation with her daughter. And then they floated away. Luckily enough, her sister took these photographs. Otherwise,
you also see it, Dr. Moody.
I saw the photographs, and I'll tell you the truth, AJ, I am not good at mechanical things. So, I'd have to leave that. Paul it is very impressive. I mean, I'm astonished.
Oh, yeah.
Paul knows a little more about cameras than I do. So but
Yeah.
my thing about this is that this this has been repeatedly demonstrated by other people than me. You know, AJ, it's like a whole psychotherapy training institute in California got interested in this. I taught them how to do it, and they taught it for years to their psychotherapy students as a mode of grief therapy. And it's already kind of accepted now as a mode of grief therapy. And the funny thing to me about, you know, this sounds so incredible and unbelievable in 2023. But if you went back 150 years, everybody knew about this. It was like a common folk understanding that you could gaze into a mirror and see spirits. And but when what happened, I think, because I had postcards showing this theme, right, from way back in the 19th century up into 1915, showed this very common. Then none. What happened in 1915? Radio. You see, before people would live in their home and they would have in the living room and they would interact and they would gaze into the mirror, they would see spirits. It was a common item of folk knowledge. But then people started first listening to the radio and then watching TV. So this went out. But it's part and parcel of Western culture from the very beginning.
Wow. So in this book, you teach people, you teach the reader how to build his own psychomantium, right? We're not going to mention that right now because we want people to buy the book, don't we?
Well, that's nice. You know, my aim in this book is I just want to help people. You know, AJ, I'm sure you're old enough to see it's like you get to a certain age. As a kid, you hear that thing, oh, it's the happiest life is a life of service to others, right? As a kid, you hear that as an ideal. Then you get into midlife and you hear it as an aspiration. But by the time you're my age, it's just a fact of experience, right? Because you learn by experience that whenever you're trying to think about yourself, you're always miserable. It's only when you realize that, hey, what makes you happy is to help other people. And so that's a big part of my motivation in this. I mean, you know, in the US, a million people died from COVID. And you think of all that grief, then all of the many people entering into midlife now where it's natural to start thinking about these things. I just thought this book would be a good way to bring a lot of interesting information to many people who seem to be in need of it now.
Great, yes. And what about you, Paul? What do you think is the most important aspect of this book, and does it really help people?
Oh, I think it really helps people. And, you know, over the years, it's funny how attitudes have changed. Because when we first wrote our first book together, The Light Beyond, I was also working on a book I wrote a lot about health, and I was working on a book on reversing heart disease. And I was dealing with my Herman Hellerstein, who's a cardiologist. And he said, in the course of having a conversation at a nurse's station in the hospital, he said, "What else are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on a book on near-death experiences." And he just stopped me and he said, "You know, I've resuscitated hundreds of people and I've never heard a near-death experience ever." And then he was called away from the nurse's stand, and all the nurses came over to me and they said, "Well, you know, we've heard dozens of these. And the reason he doesn't hear them is he doesn't talk to his patients.
Huh.
He doesn't ask them if anything happened during surgery." And that was true in those days, and doctors rejected it. And I would say a lot of society rejected it because they didn't have a context to put it into. So I used to do a thing, I called this the Denny's study. And Denny's is a restaurant here in the United States. I guess there's still some around. But one night I was out with some friends, went to a movie, and we stopped at Denny's to get a late night meal. And they said, "What are you working on?" So I told them about near-death experiences. And there were 4 or 5 people at the table. Most of them say, well, that's nonsense. No one believes that. So I stood up in the Denny's and I told people what I was working on. Have you ever experienced anything like a near-death experience? And there were about 20 people in the restaurant, and about 15 of them said they had, or their grandparents had talked about it, their fathers, or they had experiences themselves. And the people who were with them were really surprised. And it started these conversations about near-death experiences. And I think it's because they had no context to put it into, that they never talked about these experiences, or they thought that they had had a mini stroke maybe or something. But now with Raymond's book, Life After Life, they had a context. They know what a near-death experience is, and they know the so-called symptoms of the near-death experience, out-of-body experiences and seeing a bright light. And they're no longer afraid to talk about it. And that is the same thing that's going to happen with shared death experiences. Is once through this book, people get word of what a shared death experience is, what things like terminal lucidity are, they're going to realize that they've experienced them themselves. And so that's the real beauty of this book, is that it's eye-opening. It's opened a door to a place that they didn't think even had a door.
Agree. Yes, I agree. I think the most important legacy of Dr. Moody and also your legacy is the fact that you are convincing people, or you are proving that death is not the end. Life continues. You're not especially defining what comes after, because that is really hard to express. We have also talked about the ineffability of such dimension. But a lot of people, the more they hear about shared death experiences, near-death experiences, the more they lose their fear of death. And I think that's something important for people.
Yeah. I do too, AJ, because, as my psychiatry practice and my known interest in death, over the years, I've just had a lot of people come to me for that specific problem, is fear of death, which is, interfering with their life function. And the first thing you have to do in that situation is you have to figure out what it is about death that they fear. And I'll start with what I fear about it, which is pain. I don't want any, I'm not afraid of death in the regular sense, but I don't want any pain in the process, right? I've had kidney stones, I've had gallstone. I don't want that anymore. But otherwise, see, I'm fine. Other people are afraid of different things about death. Some people fear hell. Maybe they've had a severe religious training and they're, terrified about hell. Or some people are just afraid of oblivion, of just nothingness. Other people are afraid of separation from their loved ones. And some people are just afraid of the unknown. And I think it's a good thing to go and figure out for people exactly where does your fear of death lie. It's very enlightening. To me, it's the main thing is I want to stay with my kids a little longer because, I just want to see them just get a little further along. Although I'm ready to go anytime, but if it's just talking about the ideal, I'd like to stay a little longer. But I'm certainly not afraid of oblivion. I think that far from going into nothingness, you go into something that's more real than what we're experiencing now. And but you have to figure out what it is about death that scares somebody.
Right. What about you, Paul? What are your thoughts about death?
I don't think it's reasonable to tell people not to fear death, because it's just the notion of oblivion is frightening. It's like being locked in a closet and never getting out. Only maybe better, maybe worse. We don't know. But I think what our goal is to explain to them that there's another side to this that they might not really realize. And that is that maybe we don't die, that we just step into another existence, and that death is not necessarily unpleasant, but rather it's a door that opens to a whole other beautiful room. So I think that's what our goal is to be open to that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for talking about your new book. Thank you for the
Thank you,
interview.
AJ.
Okay.
You're just
Well,
delightful. Thank you so much for this. Really.
You're-
I hope I get to see you again too, AJ. This is fun.
Yeah, you will. You will not
Great.
escape from me that easily.
All right, great.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you
Bye-bye.
so much.